Multiple studies show specific nutrients and dietary patterns correlate with better working memory, executive function, and general cognition. So I looked at one of the larger studies with 1,600 adults showed that a higher intake of certain fatty acids like omega-6 and omega-3s and then oleic acid were positively associated with working memory performance. And there are some other micronutrients too, like vitamin C and vitamin D, and those were more studied in older age, but it's important to note that there are some micronutrients that we do have to take a look at. Welcome to the Wellness That Fits podcast, where we help busy moms eat well, restore energy, and clear brain fog without sacrificing family time or your sanity. I'm Cassie Greschel, registered dietitian and mom of 3. I believe wellness should fit your real life, not the other way around. If you're tired of complicated wellness trends and want simple, sustainable strategies for meal prep, holistic nutrition, and time-saving routines, you're in the right place. Let's jump in. Hey guys, and welcome back. I am so excited today to be talking about one of my favorite topics, brain fog and brain function and memory. So I love this topic because I feel like so many of us moms struggle with this. So let's dive into this a little bit more. What if you're trouble staying focused, forgetting what you just read, or feeling like your brain's in a fog isn't just normal, but a sign your brain's working memory and executive functions and systems are under strain? So what I want you guys to take away today, we're going to be talking about 3 things: what working memory is and why it matters. And if this is the first time you're hearing about it, I'm going to go more in depth with that. So what working memory is, why it matters. The second thing, what brain fog signals. And then the third thing, we're going to talk about research-backed nutrition and routines that support cognitive clarity. And couldn't we all use a little more of that? Okay, so I know myself, I have struggled, especially after having 3 kids. My kids are 6, 5, and 3. And I have struggled with brain fog a number of times. Of course, there are many reasons why you might struggle with brain fog and have an issue with cognitive function, nutrition and lack of sleep and stress and all the things, just being super busy. And for me, being a high achiever, trying to get all the things done, this has shown up in my life in a number of ways. And I know it can be really disheartening because it can reduce productivity and just really like make you feel like you're getting nothing done or you're not being efficient with your time. And I want to be able to move from be productive in my work and move from work to home life nicely and not feel like I got nothing done in the day, and so I need to work at night. And so this is why this topic matters so much to me, because I am doing what I can to be as productive and clear and focused with strategy during the day in my job so that I can be present and not moody or crabby when I'm with my kids. So let's talk about what working memory really is and why it's key. Working memory is the system that holds and manipulates information in our minds for short periods. An example of working memory might be remembering a phone number and then going out of let's say a Google search and then immediately plugging it into your phone. So remembering it and then putting it into your, and then calling that number, I should say. And then another example would be following multi-step instructions, or even switching tasks is a huge one. So it's distinct from simple short-term memory because it actually involves processing or manipulating that. So not just holding that information in our head, but then using it or processing it in a way. And research notes that simple span tasks like digit span, so remembering a series of numbers, might measure storage, but true working memory also requires manipulation and resistance to interference. And that's from Cambria University. And so let's talk about why this matters for productivity in daily life. So when you cook a recipe, you're holding what step you're on and what's next, okay? That's the holding part. At work, let's say you hold one piece of information while you work on another, or you hold that thing in your brain, you switch tasks, you go to a different maybe tab or a different program, and you have to hold that information in your head. That would be an example. Another one, if your working memory capacity is taxed, so you feel fatigue, stress, you have poor nutrition, you'll notice more errors. you'll have to reread things more frequently. More of that what was I doing moments, and I know I've had plenty of those where I am on one app in my phone and I have to access another app and I go into that app but I thought of something else and I'm like, what was I doing here? What am I transitioning into? Or maybe like you are working in something and you have to go into your email to find an answer, but then all of a sudden something pops up in, an email that you want to read an answer. And then you're like, wait, why was I even in my inbox? Right. So like those are good examples of working memory and why it really matters for productivity in daily life. Okay, so a couple extra facts. The frontoparietal network in your brain is heavily involved in working memory tasks. And some implications and why this matters again is that efficient working memory gives you mental bandwidth. And if working memory is overloaded, everything feels harder. Have you ever felt that way where everything you're doing should be a simple task? It should be so simple. Like I love the question, what's for dinner, right? Because it should be so simple. Like, what's for dinner? Okay, let me just think of this and, make a decision based on a few of my favorite meals or the family's meals or whatever. But it just feels like everything at the end of the day, your memory is just completely, or I should say your focus is maybe completely shot and everything just feels so hard to think, or making those decisions at the end of the day is just so hard. And so that's why we really want to improve upon or what we can do, focus on what we can do to make that a little better. Okay, so now we're going to talk about brain fog, what it is and what's causing it. So brain fog isn't necessarily like a clinical symptom, but rather it's more of like a subjective sense of mental sluggishness, forgetfulness, trouble focusing, difficulty following tasks. And so like some more examples would be if you are forgetting appointments or if forgetting things at your kid's school or something like that. So when working memory is under long-term strain or when executive control is weak, that is when we might see that, or when nutritional support is poor. So we're talking about poor diet, you have blood sugar crashes. And when I talk about that, I'm like thinking the timing of meals as well. So maybe you're skipping breakfast, you're eating a lot for lunch and it's more carb heavy versus like incorporating more like the protein and fats. And then at night, again, you're skipping dinner, but then you're eating late night, and then the quality of the diet, of course, matters. It's not just timing. Are you eating enough fiber? Is there enough protein and omega-3s and things like that in your diet? And then there's, of course, some nutrition deficiencies as well, depending on the quality of your diet. So when routines are disorderly, like maybe you aren't getting adequate sleep or your sleep times really vary. And guess what? This is very common, especially in parenthood, to have not necessarily consistent sleep schedules, or other things are disorderly, like maybe your stress. Some weeks we have high stress levels. Some weeks we have low. Sometimes we have seasons of high stress constantly. And so that's kind of how brain fog might show up too when we are in those seasons of high stress. Another thing is like constant task switching. When we set up our day where we are checking emails and then 30 minutes we're doing this other task and then we check emails and then 30 minutes of this other task, instead of like batch prepping or batching certain content or making content or batching similar tasks, like we get all of our bills done at one time, right? You're not going to pay a water bill and then check your emails and then pay this bill. And then that would be an example of task switching. And so when they're very disorderly like that, that is where brain fog has a very high chance of coming into play. And all of those things, like your brain is constantly using its executive functioning to switch tasks, that is going to lead to cognitive overload. So a little bit more of the research that I want to talk about, because I always want to bring science into this, is that diets high in simple sugars, high saturated fat, or poor nutrition profile have been associated with worse memory and learning and also cognitive performance. So it's really important that we focus on that diet quality. All right, so brain fog might be a flag. Your brain's working memory attention systems are not getting the fuel or rest that they need. And that's really key to start thinking about those instances in your life where maybe you've noticed the forgetfulness, the memory issues, the productivity decrease, the focus decrease. And let's try to align that and see if we can find a cause for that. And of course, there are many, but I like to kind of talk about nutrition first. So that's actually where we're going to talk about nutrition and how it relates to working memory. So we'll take a look at what the research shows. Multiple studies show specific nutrients and dietary patterns correlate with better working memory, executive function, and general cognition. So I looked at a lot of studies, larger studies that have a number of adults, like 1,000 adults. Some of them were a little bit smaller, but one of the larger studies with 1,600 adults showed that a higher intake of vitamin B6 and certain acids like linolenic, alpha-linolenic, so those are omega-6 and omega-3s, and then oleic acid, were positively associated with working memory performance. And there are some other micronutrients too, like vitamin C and vitamin D, and those were more studied in older age, but it's important to note that there are some micronutrients that we do have to take a look at in vitamins and minerals. All right, so macronutrient review. Macronutrient would be like, most people know what macros are now, but if you don't, it's going to be your carbs, your protein, your fat. And what they showed is that a higher simple carbohydrate or sugar, simple carbs, it doesn't necessarily mean sugar, but usually a higher simple carb intake correlates with decreased cognitive function. So complex carbs, higher protein intake, improved executive working memory when task demands were high. Let me say that again because that's so important. So looking at two sides of the spectrum, right? So we have more simple sugars. So more simple sugars is correlated with a decreased cognitive function, whereas complex carbs, we're talking whole grain things like quinoa, whole grain pasta, whole grain bread, things like that, whole grain or brown rice. So complex carbohydrates and higher protein intake was correlated with improved executive working memory when task demands were high. So another one I wanted to mention is that protein from nuts, and also nuts and seeds. So thinking really along the lines of Mediterranean style eating patterns shows that there was an improvement in working memory and executive domains. And so that was done by Cambridge University Press and Assessment. So I also looked into dietary lutein and zeaxanthin, which are carotenoids in leafy greens and eggs and fish, and they were also associated with better recall. Though that study was done in older adults, I still like to look at those studies for younger people as well, because it might be a little bit of a window into a wider picture that we could work towards as we age. All right, so when we look at the mechanisms, nutrition influences working memory because of the glucose and insulin metabolism, and for a number of reasons. So basically, nutrient-dense, balanced meals matter for cognitive clarity and working memory capacity. All right, so lastly, want to talk about practical nutrition and routine strategies for focused memory and reduced brain fog. Nutrition habits. All right, so we're actually going to talk about nutrition habits and then routine and behavior habits, and then a couple examples. So first, really getting into nutrition. I know we talked more specific studies, but let's talk about how we can actually apply them to your life. So we want to ensure adequate protein, especially when tasks are cognitively demanding. So let's make sure we are including enough protein at breakfast time or pretty early in the morning, I would say. Of course, it depends on your schedule and what works for you and what doesn't, and when you're working out and when you aren't. But I would say adequate protein in the morning really sets you up for satiety and also metabolically so that your body can use those proteins well. And so based on the meta-analysis that we were discussing here, it shows that working memory benefits from higher protein intake when the task demand is high. All right, another thing we can do is prioritize healthy fats. So let's make sure we are getting healthy fats from olive oil, like extra virgin olive oil. We are getting the omega-3s that we need from nuts, seeds, and also omega-3 from fatty fish. So salmon, tuna, herring, sardines, trout, things like that. And that's going to support the brain membrane, the cell membranes, and then also working memory. All right, we want to choose complex carbs over simple sugars. So what does this mean? Instead of, this is an extremely simple example, but instead of white bread, we want to choose a whole grain style bread, or maybe instead of bread, we serve a high protein bean pasta. And that's going to really help stabilize and maintain blood glucose levels and help us avoid those crashes that really tax working memory and kind of lead us to that brain fog where we have a lot of sugar going through our system and then all of a sudden we have hardly any going through our system, and then really focusing on the protein and the carb intake together. All right, and then we want to include carotenoid-rich veggies. So what does this mean? When we talked about that lutein, we want to include, well, first of all, we want to include antioxidants of a lot of different colors, but specifically when we're talking about that carotenoid and lutein and zeaxanthin, we want to increase leafy veggies. So even if you just add one leafy green veggie, let's say we want to add spinach to a smoothie, or you want to add kale to a white bean soup, or you want to top your tacos with romaine or with some shredded cabbage. So those would all be great examples. And then we want to avoid or reduce high saturated fat and high processed, more so high processed sugary foods and high processed foods in general as much as possible. So really staying away from those highly processed packaged items and replacing them with more whole foods. All right, in terms of routine and behavior, let's talk a little bit about meal prep because that's super important. Meal prep reduces decision making and it frees working memory from constant planning tasks. Like think about if you had to prep a meal every single night and you had to follow all the steps in the recipe, whereas if you just chose one meal prep day, like let's say a Sunday, for example, you're doing everything at once, right? You're batching or you're chopping all your veggies at once, or maybe you're making a soup and you're washing all your produce and fruits for the kids' lunches and you're chopping the veggies for your meals. You're doing that all at once. Not only are you reducing dishes, but you're reducing that constant executive functioning and that switching of tasks. All right, structured meal times are really important. So avoid long gaps that lead to glucose dips or excessive hunger, which may impair attention and working memory. Sleep hygiene. Of course, we could have an entire podcast on this, but I just want to throw this in there because this is a routine and behavior habit that is going to dramatically improve your cognitive function. Without good sleep, working memory capacity is reduced. It's plain and simple. It is just reduced. Your brain cannot reset well when you do not have adequate sleep. And even nap research shows that there is improvements in working memory after rest. So if you are a person, maybe you have really young children, infants, and you're just not on a good sleep routine, not getting enough sleep, naps are great if you can fit them in, of course. Okay, the next one is task batching and focus blocks. We talked about task batching in regards to meal prep, but I also want to talk about task batching when we're thinking about all the jobs that we need to do throughout the day. And so we want to reduce multitasking, which otherwise constantly overloads working memory and executive systems, right? Because we're like trying to make 1,000 decisions, trying to do all the things all at once. And you want to batch your work, whether it's content creation, whether it's paying bills, whether it is anything else that you're doing, answering emails, put them all into blocks of time that you plan ahead and you know that you're going to be doing it in a certain time frame. Okay, another routine and behavior habit that might be beneficial to you is to use offloading tools. Not all tasks need to be held in working memory. So when we can, right, let's use notes, let's use checklists, let's use visual cues, or planners are great, or Google Calendar to schedule tasks and to-do lists, or Notion for to-do lists and tasks. This greatly reduces cognitive load and supports clarity. All right, so if we want some really clear examples, I would say let's start with tomorrow morning, right? Let's start with eating a breakfast with eggs. So you're going to have your protein and choline, whole grain toast, or if you're gluten-free, you could try something else, or even sweet potato toast, which is a complex carb, and then a little bit of fruit or antioxidants and a handful of nuts, right? So you're giving your brain a really strong start. That is just one area that you could improve your nutrition and timing and quality of your diet to help your brain function better. All right, so working memory, just to recap, working memory is your mental workspace. When it's taxed, you get brain fog. You get forgetfulness and slower thinking, and nutrition and routines aren't optional extras, honestly. They're foundational to clear thinking and productivity. Research shows that what you eat and how you structure your day directly affect your working memory and focus. All right, so I want you to think about and choose one change that you're going to make this week, whether it's a handful of nuts or you're eating a high protein breakfast or you're preparing one recipe ahead of time. And I want you to tag me on Instagram at Wellness That Fits, or you can shoot me an email, Cassie at wellnessthatfits.com. I'd love to hear about the one thing that you chose. All right. Thank you so much for listening today. And until next time, keep building wellness that fits. Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode of the Wellness That Fits podcast. I hope you walk away with simple, doable steps you can put into practice right away. If you loved this episode, it would mean the world if you subscribed, left a review, or shared it with another busy mom who could use some encouragement. Until next time, friends, keep creating wellness that fits your life.